Good evening, generals, and welcome to our series of Men Around the Führer. In the autumn of 1903, in the picturesque Inn River Valley near the Austrian town of Riedem-Innkreis, a son was born to Hugo and Theresia Kaltenbrunner. The family came from solid middle-class stock. His father and grandfather were both lawyers, men who built their careers on upholding law and justice. Yet their descendant would grow to become one of history's most monstrous criminals, a man who would pervert every principle of justice into an instrument of mass murder. The boy spent his early years in the small town of Raab before attending the Real Gymnasium in Linz. It was an unremarkable childhood in many ways, except for one detail that would prove darkly prophetic. Among his boyhood friends was another Austrian lad named Adolf Eichmann, two ordinary boys playing in the streets of Linz, neither yet aware of the roles they would play in history's greatest crime. His family harbored strong pan-Germanic and nationalist sentiments, part of a broader movement among German-speaking Austrians who viewed the separation of Austria and Germany as an artificial wound that needed healing. This ideology came wrapped in anti-Semitism and racial theories that portrayed political conflict as racial struggle. The young man absorbed these ideas like water into soil. When he arrived at the University of Graz, he initially studied chemistry, but quickly switched to law, following the family tradition. University life in the turbulent 1920s became his true education in extremism. He joined the Arminia fraternity, one of the notorious Burschenschaften, student organizations that served as breeding grounds for nationalist fervor and racial hatred. These fraternities practiced ritual dueling, their members deliberately scarring each other's faces as badges of honor and masculine virtue. His face bore deep scars that would mark him for life. The official story claimed they came from these student duels, romantic wounds earned in defense of honor. But whispers suggested a less noble origin, a drunken driving accident. Regardless of their source, those scars gave him a menacing appearance that would serve him well. Combined with his towering height of 6 feet 7 inches, massive shoulders, and powerful build, he cut an imposing figure. Even in a regime filled with brutal men, he stood out physically. It was later said that even Heinrich Himmler himself feared this giant from Austria. After earning his doctorate in law in 1926, he worked briefly at a firm in Salzburg before opening his own practice in Linz. By his own later account, he felt bored, lonely, and unfulfilled by provincial legal work. The quiet life of a country lawyer couldn't satisfy the ambitions growing within him. He joined right-wing gymnastic societies with ties to the paramilitary Heimwehr, finding in physical training and political activism the purpose that legal briefs could not provide. The year 1930 brought his formal entry into the Nazi Party. His membership number was 300,179. A year later, he joined the SS in Austria, where it still operated as an underground organization. His SS number was 13,039. He became both a district speaker for the movement and a legal consultant for SS Division 8, using his law degree to defend party members from the Austrian government's prosecutions. Austria in the early 30s was a battleground between competing visions of the nation's future. The authoritarian government of Engelbert Dollfuss had banned the Nazi Party, driving it underground and into violent resistance. In January of 1934, our subject was briefly imprisoned at Kaisersteinbruch concentration camp alongside other National Socialists. Later that year, when Nazi conspirators assassinated Chancellor Dollfuss in a failed putsch, he was arrested again on suspicion of high treason. Though ultimately released, the experience cost him his law license, but by then, he had found a different calling. From mid-1935 onward, he led the Austrian SS, transforming it into a formidable underground army. He proved to have a remarkable talent for intelligence work, building networks that infiltrated government offices, police departments, and military installations throughout Austria. This massive espionage organization, radiating outward from Austria toward the southeast, would eventually catch the attention of the man who controlled the SS security apparatus. Heinrich Himmler. March of 1938 brought the Anschluss, Germany's forced annexation of Austria. While the operation was orchestrated from Berlin, local Nazis played crucial roles. He assisted in the takeover, coordinating SS and police actions that terrorized potential resistors into submission. The night before the German troops crossed the border, 500 Austrian National Socialists seized control of government buildings in Vienna. He was among the organizers of this internal coup. His reward came swiftly. On the very day the Anschluss was completed, Hitler promoted him to SS Brigadeführer. He became State Secretary for Public Security in the brief Seyss-Inquart puppet government. 6 months later, he was promoted to SS Gruppenführer. He was also appointed higher SS and police leader for the Danube region, a position that made him the de facto ruler of Austria, answering only to Himmler. One of his first acts was establishing a concentration camp near Linz, in a picturesque area called Mauthausen. He would later boast about helping to build up this camp during a visit in 1944, proudly telling his department chiefs about its valuable armament work. The euphemism was transparent. Mauthausen was classified as a Category 3 camp, the harshest designation, reserved for prisoners, the regime considered most dangerous and beyond redemption. The camp's stone quarry became a notorious death trap, the stairs of death, where prisoners were literally worked to death carrying massive blocks of stone up 186 steps. During the summer of 1943, he conducted an inspection tour of Mauthausen. While there, 15 prisoners were selected to demonstrate 3 different methods of killing for his benefit: shooting in the back of the neck, hanging, and gassing. After watching these demonstrations, he inspected the crematorium and toured the quarry. This was not administrative distance. This was personal interest in the mechanics of murder. For 5 years, he ruled Austria with an iron fist, expanding his intelligence networks and deepening his involvement in the regime's darkest activities. In June of 1940, he was appointed police president of Vienna. A month later, he was commissioned as an SS Untersturmführer in the Waffen-SS Reserve. By April of 1941, he held the rank of Lieutenant General of Police, but his ambitions reached far beyond Austria. In December of 1940, while still based in Austria, he attended a fateful meeting. According to testimony later given at Nuremberg, this meeting included Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich. At this meeting, the group decided that all Jews incapable of heavy physical work would be gassed. This was 1940, more than a year before the Wannsee Conference, that is often cited as the formal decision point for the final solution. He was present when this decision was made. He knew what was coming. When Reinhard Heydrich, the so-called blonde beast and chief of the Reich Security Main Office, was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in June of 1942, a power vacuum opened at the heart of Nazi terror. The RSHA controlled the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SD security service. It was the nerve center of the Holocaust, the organization that coordinated the murder of millions. Himmler temporarily took direct control, but he needed someone to run the day-to-day operations. Many expected Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, or Walter Schellenberg, the foreign intelligence chief, to be chosen. Instead, in January of 1943, the Austrian lawyer with the scarred face got the call to Berlin. Historians have speculated about this surprising choice. The Austrian was relatively unknown in Berlin circles, a comparative newcomer to the upper echelons of the SS hierarchy. Some suggest Himmler chose him precisely because he would be more pliable, easier to control than the ambitious Müller or the cunning Schellenberg. If that was the calculation, it proved catastrophically wrong. He moved into headquarters at Prinz Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, taking command of an empire of death. The RSHA was organized into 7 main offices: personnel, administration, domestic intelligence, the Gestapo, the criminal police, foreign intelligence, and ideological research. Through these offices flowed the orders that sent millions to their deaths. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union and shot more than 1 million Jews, reported through his chain of command. The deportation trains that carried Jews from across Europe to the death camps moved on his orders. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec operated under his ultimate authority. When Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, later testified at Nuremberg, he stated that under this man's orders, 3 million people had been gassed at Auschwitz alone. Yet he maintained a deliberate distance from the camps themselves. Höss testified that he had met with him only once, in 1944, and that meeting concerned labor issues at Mauthausen, not the extermination program. Most execution orders bore not his signature, but that of Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo chief. This was by design. He understood the value of deniability. Let others sign the death warrants. Let others maintain the detailed records. He would control the system without leaving obvious fingerprints. But the documents told a different story. When Miller signed execution orders, they bore the annotation by order of or as representative of the chief of the RSHA. The chain of command was clear. Nothing of significance happened in the RSHA without his knowledge or approval. In February of 1944, he achieved another expansion of power, absorbing the Abwehr, the military intelligence service, into the RSHA after Admiral Canaris fell from grace. Now he controlled not just security and police intelligence, but military intelligence as well. His empire was nearly complete. Sometime in the autumn of 1943, according to Soviet intelligence sources, he was given operational control of a mission called Operation Long Jump, an audacious plan to assassinate the Big Three Allied leaders at the Tehran Conference. The mission, allegedly to be led by Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, aimed to kill Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt simultaneously during their November meeting in the Iranian capital. Whether this operation truly existed remains controversial. Soviet intelligence claimed they uncovered the plot when a drunken German officer revealed it to a Soviet agent. The Soviets said they arrested German radio operators dropped by parachute near Tehran and forced them to radio back that the mission was compromised, preventing Skorzeny's team from being deployed. Western historians have long been skeptical, suggesting Stalin invented the plot to persuade Roosevelt to stay in bugged Soviet embassy quarters. Skorzeny himself denied after the war that the operation had ever existed in any serious form. The truth remains murky, lost in the fog of espionage and counter-espionage. What is beyond dispute is what happened on the 20th of July, 1944. A bomb exploded in Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. The Führer survived, barely. Immediately, he was summoned from Berlin to begin the investigation. What he uncovered was a massive conspiracy involving senior Wehrmacht officers, diplomats, and members of the German aristocracy. They had tried to kill Hitler and overthrow the regime. The purge that followed was merciless and methodical. He personally directed the investigations, the arrests, the interrogations. Before the bloodletting concluded, upward of 5,000 people had been executed. Thousands more were sent to concentration camps. He ensured that not just the conspirators, but their families suffered. Wives, children, siblings, even distant relatives of the accused were arrested. Many were murdered under the ancient Germanic principle of Sippenhaft, blood guilt that extended to the entire family line. The trials were show trials presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler in the People's Court. Many of the convicted military officers were executed by hanging from piano wire suspended from meat hooks, an agonizingly slow death that was filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. This bloodbath brought him even closer to Hitler. He gained direct access to the Führer, bypassing even Himmler in the hierarchy. In the final months of the war, he spent hours each day with Hitler, becoming one of the dictator's most trusted confidants. Even Himmler, who theoretically outranked him, feared him. Schellenberg later testified that Himmler once said, "How am I going to negotiate with the International Red Cross with him around? I should then be completely at his mercy." In December of 1944, he was promoted to General of the Waffen-SS and awarded the Knight's Cross of the War Merit Cross with swords. He also received the Golden Party Badge and the Blood Order, decorations that marked him as one of the Nazi elite. As the Reich crumbled around him, his power paradoxically grew. In February of 1945, he issued a decree that allowed policemen to shoot anyone deemed disloyal at their own discretion, without any judicial review whatsoever. Germany had descended into arbitrary terror, and he was its chief architect. The RSHA under his command was also responsible for another notorious war crime, the murder of 50 Allied officers who had escaped from Stalag Luft III in the famous Great Escape of March 1944. When 76 prisoners tunneled out of the camp, Hitler flew into a rage and initially ordered all recaptured escapees to be shot. After Göring and others argued that such a massacre might bring reprisals against German prisoners, Hitler agreed to only 50 executions. Himmler set up the logistics, but the Gestapo, under the RSHA's command, carried out the murders. The recaptured officers were taken from civilian or military prisons, driven to remote locations, and shot from behind, typically while they were relieving themselves by the roadside. The Gestapo reports all claimed the prisoners had been shot while attempting to escape, a euphemism that would become infamous as a byword for cold-blooded murder. While Heinrich Himmler directly supervised these killings, they happened under his ultimate authority as RSHA chief, but even he could see the end approaching. While publicly proclaiming loyalty to the bitter end, he was counted among Hitler's fanatical loyalists. He privately began exploring options. Toward the end of 1944 and into early 1945, he made tentative attempts to establish contact with the Western Allies through Alan Dulles, the head of the OSS in Switzerland. He promoted himself as the one man who truly understood Bolshevism, suggesting he could be useful in the coming conflict between East and West. He proposed forming an anti-communist Free Austria movement that could serve as a bridge to negotiations. These overtures went nowhere. The Allies had no interest in dealing with the man who ran the machinery of the Holocaust, regardless of what he claimed to know about the Soviets. In mid-April of 1945, as Soviet and American forces closed in on Berlin from opposite directions, Himmler named him commander-in-chief of the remaining German forces in southern Europe. It was a meaningless title by then, a desperate gesture in the regime's death throes. He attempted to organize stay-behind networks for post-war resistance, dividing command between Otto Skorzeny, who would handle sabotage operations, and Wilhelm von Eck, who would maintain intelligence contacts. But time had run out. As the walls closed in, he fled south to the Salzkammergut region of Austria, to a place he knew intimately from summer vacations, the lakeside resort town of Altaussee, nestled in the Austrian Alps. His longtime mistress, Countess Gisela von Westarp, was already there. The vivacious young blonde, just 22 years old with striking blue eyes and exceptional intelligence, had been working at Himmler's Berlin headquarters when he arrived to take over the RSHA in early 1943. They had begun an affair that produced twins, Ursula and Wolfgang, born in a cowshed in Altaussee in March of 1945. While his official wife Elizabeth and their 3 children remained elsewhere, he sought refuge with his mistress and newborn babies in the mountains. On the 12th of May, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender, Sergeant Robert Madison of the 80th Infantry Division's Counterintelligence Corps began climbing toward a remote cabin high in the Totes-Gebirge, the Dead Mountains. The climb took 5 hours through 20 to 30 feet of snow, the last 4 kilometers with no cover except snowdrifts. Madison's team had been hunting him for weeks, following leads through the Austrian resistance movement and interrogating captured Nazis. They had arrested his wife in the village of Strobel on the 6th of May. Through discussions with local citizens and members of the Austrian freedom movement, they learned that he had been seen at a mountain cabin called the Wildensee Hut. As dawn broke on the 13th, Madison approached the cabin alone. A man emerged, not their target, but Arthur Scheidler, his adjutant. Madison handed him a note from Gisela, urging her lover to surrender into safe custody with the Americans, rather than let himself be taken, and probably killed, by the Russians. Scheidler initially denied anyone else was inside, but when the Austrian guides suddenly appeared behind Madison, panic set in. Scheidler pulled a weapon and fled back into the cabin. Madison retreated, expecting a firefight. 10 minutes later, 4 men emerged with their hands raised. The target, Scheidler, and 2 SS guards. The tall one with the scarred face claimed to be a Wehrmacht doctor named Unterwegen and produced papers to prove it, authentic documents from a deceased physician. The Americans played along, marching the prisoners down the mountain to Altaussee village. As they walked through the main street, a crowd gathered. Suddenly, 2 women broke from the crowd and rushed forward. Gisela von Westarp and Iris Scheidler, the wife of the adjutant, threw their arms around their men. That impulsive embrace sealed his fate. The Americans now knew for certain they had captured the chief of the RSHA. A search of the cabin revealed damning evidence: his family photographs, his RSHA identification card, and most tellingly, his Gestapo badge, number 2, second only to Himmler, were found hidden in the stove's ashpan. He had tried to destroy the evidence but hadn't had time to complete the job. Years later, in 2001, a Dutch tourist would find his personal security seal in an alpine lake, where he had thrown it in a last desperate attempt to hide his identity. At the Nuremberg trials, he was charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Initially, he couldn't appear in court. 2 episodes of subarachnoid hemorrhage, bleeding in the brain, required weeks of recovery. His lawyer requested acquittal on health grounds, arguing he was medically unfit to stand trial. The request was denied. When his health improved sufficiently, he was wheeled into court. When he finally took the stand, he mounted an audacious defense. He claimed that all documents bearing his signature were rubber-stamped by his adjutants without his knowledge. He insisted that Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo chief, had illegally affixed his signature to many documents. He argued that his position as RSHA chief existed only in theory, that he had only concerned himself with intelligence and espionage while Himmler was truly responsible for the atrocities. Most brazenly, he claimed he had been unaware of the final solution until 1943, and that upon learning of it, he had protested to both Hitler and Himmler. He even claimed he was responsible for bringing the persecution of Jews to an end in October of 1944. He denied ever visiting Auschwitz, despite documentation proving otherwise. He denied knowledge of the Commissar Order, the directive to execute Soviet political officers. He denied involvement in the Stalag Luft Third murders. When he made these claims, people in the courtroom laughed. The prosecution's key witness was Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Ironically, Höss was called as a defense witness by his own lawyer, Kurt Kaufmann, in an attempt to prove that orders came from Müller and Himmler, rather than from the defendant. But under cross-examination by American prosecutor Colonel John Amon, Höss's testimony destroyed whatever remained of the defense. Höss confirmed that while most execution orders bore Müller's signature, they were always signed by order of or as representative of the chief of the RSHA. Höss detailed how the RSHA had organized and supervised the entire extermination program. He described receiving reports about the gassings at Auschwitz, about the deportation schedules, about the selection process that sent people to immediate death or temporary slavery. When Kaufmann asked Höss if the defendant had ever visited Auschwitz, Höss said no. But this actually worked against the defense. It demonstrated that he had run the machinery of death from a distance, never confronting the human reality of his orders. It showed his guilt was administrative, systematic, bureaucratic, not a crime of passion, but a crime of cold calculation. The tribunal found him not guilty of crimes against peace. He had not been part of planning aggressive war. But on the 30th of September, 1946, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On the 1st of October, the tribunal sentenced him to death by hanging. Of all the condemned men, he was the only one who did not plead for leniency to the Allied Control Council. He accepted his fate with grim resignation. On the 16th of October, shortly after 1:30 in the morning, he entered the execution chamber in Nuremberg prison. He wore a sweater beneath his blue double-breasted coat, with his lean, haggard face furrowed by those old scars. Kingsbury Smith of the International News Service, who witnessed the execution, wrote that he had a frightening look as he glanced around the room. He wet his lips nervously as he turned to mount the gallows, but he walked steadily. He answered his name in a calm, low voice. When asked if he had any last statement, he said, "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry this time my people were led by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge. Germany, good luck." The black hood was placed over his head. The noose of 13 coils was fitted around his neck. The trapdoor opened at 1:36 a.m. The giant fell. The rope snapped taut. The man who had sent millions to their deaths, who had orchestrated the machinery of the Holocaust, who had purged thousands after the July 20th plot, who had ruled through terror and intimidation, died at the end of a rope. He was 43 years old. His body, like those of the other 9 executed men, and that of Hermann Göring, who had cheated the gallows through suicide, was cremated at Munich's Eastern Cemetery. The ashes were scattered in a tributary of the river Isar, ensuring no shrine could ever be built to honor him. His name survives only as a warning from history, the giant in the shadows who transformed law into lawlessness, order into chaos, and justice into genocide. He was the faceless bureaucrat of death, the administrator of apocalypse, proof that the greatest crimes are not always committed by madmen screaming their hatred, but sometimes by educated professionals who kill with paperwork and distance themselves from the consequences of their orders. In the end, the scarred face that had intimidated even Himmler became just another photograph in the archives of infamy. A reminder that evil does not always announce itself with fanfare, but sometimes arrives quietly, carrying a law degree and speaking of duty. That's all for tonight. Thanks for watching.